The heavy oak doors of the attorney's office were meant to intimidate, but they were no match for a steel-toed boot. When the president of the local Hells Angels charter kicked them open, the sound echoed like a gunshot. Inside, a slick lawyer froze, his pen hovering over a document that would strip an 86-year-old woman of her entire life. Beside the biker stood the frail, lavender-clad woman, her chin held high. The lawyer smirked, thinking it was a bluff. But then, the biker slammed a rusted Zippo lighter on the mahogany desk, a lighter that belonged to a dead man. The room went ice cold. The Mojave sun was entirely unforgiving, baking the asphalt of Route 66 until the horizon shimmered with heat mirages. Nestled on the ragged edge of town stood the Iron Horse, a roadhouse diner that smelled permanently of stale beer, burned coffee, and heavy motor oil. It was undisputed Hells Angels territory. Civilian cars rarely dared to park in the dirt lot, which was currently lined with 30 gleaming, customized Harley-Davidson motorcycles. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and the low, rumbling laughter of hardened men. Arthur Pendleton, known to everyone who mattered as Rooster, sat at the head of the largest booth. At 52, Rooster was a mountain of a man, his arms a canvas of faded ink, his leather cut bearing the coveted president patch over his heart. Flanking him were his two most trusted enforcers. Callum Chibbs Boyd, a wiry Scot with a jagged scar cutting through his eyebrow, and David Grizzly Carmichael, a man whose beard and sheer mass earned him his moniker. They were deep into a conversation about a supply run when the heavy, rusted hinge of the diner's front door whined in protest. The sound wasn't unusual, but the silence that followed it was deafening. The jukebox, playing a heavy bass track, seemed to fade into the background. One by one, the bikers stopped talking, turning their heads toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway, clutching a worn leather handbag with both hands, was an elderly woman. She looked to be at least 80-something, barely pushing 5 feet tall. She wore a neatly pressed lavender cardigan, a floral skirt, and orthopedic shoes. Her silver hair was pinned up flawlessly, not a single strand out of place despite the desert wind outside. She looked completely, utterly, and dangerously out of place. "Lost your way, Grandma?" one of the prospects near the door sneered, earning a sharp elbow to the ribs from an older member. You didn't disrespect elders without a reason, even in a biker bar. The woman didn't flinch at the prospect's taunt. Her pale, milky blue eyes scanned the dark, intimidating room. They bypassed the pool tables, ignored the hostile glares, and locked directly onto Rooster. With slow, deliberate steps, she walked across the sticky linoleum floor. The sea of leather and denim parted for her, out of sheer bewilderment more than anything else. Grizzly shifted his massive frame, subtly blocking her path to Rooster, but Rooster raised a calloused hand. "Let her through, Grizz," Rooster rumbled, his voice like gravel, grinding in a cement mixer. The woman stopped inches from the table. She looked at the half-empty bottles of whiskey, the folding knives resting on the tabletop, and finally, into Rooster's cold, assessing eyes. "My name is Beatrice Caldwell," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady, though thin with age. "And I need to know which one of you is in charge." Rooster leaned back, the leather of his booth creaking. "You're looking at him, Mrs. Caldwell. Name's Rooster. And unless you're here to sell Girl Scout cookies, I suggest you turn around. This ain't a place for ladies of your refinement." Beatrice took a deep breath, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her handbag. "I am not lost, Mr. Rooster. I drove here specifically to find you. I have a proposition." Chibbs let out a bark of laughter. "A proposition? Darlin', you're about 50 years too late for the kind of propositions we entertain." Beatrice didn't blink. She reached into her handbag. Instantly, 3 men at the table had their hands hovering over their waistbands, instinct kicking in. But all she pulled out was a thick stack of $100 bills bound tightly with a rubber band and a faded, dog-eared photograph. She placed both on the scarred wooden table. $10,000 in cash, Beatrice stated, her voice slicing through the heavy air. "For 1 day of your time." Rooster stared at the money, then up at her. The club wasn't exactly hurting for cash, but 10 grand for a day's work was enough to make any man pause. What kind of work? He asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Beatrice leaned forward, her gaze unwavering, and uttered the words that would alter the course of all their lives. I need you to pretend to be my son today. The silence returned, thicker and heavier than before. Grizzly exchanged a baffled look with Chibs. Rooster stared at the woman, searching for the punchline, for the hidden camera, for the onset of dementia. But her eyes were sharp, desperate, and terrifyingly lucid. Lady, Rooster said slowly, I think the desert heat has cooked your brain. I'm a Hell's Angel. I've got a rap sheet longer than a CVS receipt, and I look like I eat nails for breakfast. Do I look like your son? Look at the photograph, she commanded, her tone brooking no argument. Rooster slid the faded picture across the table. It was a Polaroid, dated somewhere in the late 1990s. It showed a young man in his 20s, leaning against a custom chopper. He had wild hair, a hardened jawline, and Rooster felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. A distinct, jagged scar running vertically down the left side of his chin. Rooster reached up, his thumb brushing against the exact same scar on his own chin. A souvenir from a bar fight in Reno decades ago. Richard was a wild boy, Beatrice whispered, the hardened shell around her cracking just a fraction. He rode with a bad crowd up in Oakland. We fought. I kicked him out. He swore he'd never return, and he kept that promise. He's been gone 22 years. If he's been gone that long, why do you need me to play him today? Rooster asked, genuinely intrigued now. The physical resemblance in the jawline and eyes was uncanny, though Rooster knew for a fact his mother was buried in a pauper's grave in Chicago. Because, Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, if my son doesn't walk into Jonathan Sterling's office by 3 o'clock this afternoon, I am going to lose everything I have ever loved, and they are going to lock me away. Rooster gestured to the empty seat across from him. Sit down, Mrs. Caldwell. Grizz, get the lady a coffee. Black, right? With 2 sugars, if you please, Beatrice said, sliding into the booth. The juxtaposition of the dainty woman sitting among the heavily armed bikers looked like a scene from a surrealist painting. As Grizzly lumbered off to the counter, Rooster crossed his arms. Start talking. Who is Jonathan Sterling, and why do you need a fake dead son? Beatrice smoothed the wrinkles of her skirt, her composure fully restored. Jonathan Sterling is my late husband's estate lawyer. When my husband Arthur passed away 3 months ago, he left behind a considerable estate. The Caldwell orchards out in the valley, our family home, and several trusts. But Arthur, bless his heart, made a mistake. He appointed Sterling as the executor of the estate, and as my conservator, should my health ever fail. Let me guess, Chibs chimed in, leaning forward. Your health is failing? My health is perfectly fine, Beatrice snapped, a fiery spark in her eyes. My mind is as sharp as a tack. But Sterling is greedy. He knows that if he can prove I am mentally incompetent, he gains full control over the estate. He can liquidate the assets, sell the orchards to commercial developers, and take a massive cut of the profits. Happens every day, Rooster noted grimly. Old folks get pushed into homes by suits looking to cash out. Why don't you just fire him? I tried, Beatrice sighed. But Sterling has a judge in his pocket, Judge Harrison. They've manufactured medical records claiming I have late-stage Alzheimer's. They've scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning to finalize the conservatorship and move me into a locked psychiatric facility. A low growl escaped Grizzly's throat as he returned, setting a chipped mug of sugary coffee in front of her. Bikers lived outside the law, but they lived by a strict code. Preying on children and the elderly was a violation of that code. So, where does the fake son come in? Rooster asked, tapping the Polaroid. The estate trust has an ironclad contingency, Beatrice explained, leaning in. If my husband passed, the estate goes to me. But if my competence is challenged, the power of attorney defaults to our only living heir, Richard. Sterling has spent the last 3 months trying to have Richard declared legally dead in absentia so he can bypass the clause. But the waiting period for the death declaration expires today at 5 p.m. Rooster began to piece it together. Sterling thinks Richard is dead. If Richard suddenly walks into his office before 5 p.m. today, the conservatorship hearing is nullified, Beatrice finished. The power of attorney transfers immediately to Richard. Sterling loses all legal authority over me and my home. It stops him dead in his tracks. Chibbs whistled low. That's brilliant, Mrs. C. But Sterling ain't an idiot. If he's a slick lawyer, he's gonna ask for ID. He's gonna know Rooster ain't Richard Caldwell. Sterling was hired 5 years ago, Beatrice countered. He never met Richard. No one in that office has. As for identification, Richard left his wallet behind the night he stormed out. She reached into her bag again and pulled out a cracked leather wallet, tossing it onto the table. Rooster opened it. Inside was a California driver's license from 1999. The picture matched the Polaroid. The name read, Richard Thomas Caldwell. Date of birth made him 51 years old. Rooster was 52. You don't need to be him forever, Beatrice pleaded, her voice finally breaking, revealing the terrified old woman beneath the steel facade. Just for today. Just long enough to march into that office, sign the revocation of Sterling's authority, and walk out. Once Sterling is removed, I can hire a real lawyer to untangle the mess. Please, I have no one else. I saw you riding through town last week. I saw the scar. It was like looking at a ghost. Rooster stared at the woman. He looked at the stack of money. He didn't care about the 10 grand. He cared about the audacity of this 6-year-old woman walking into a Hells Angels stronghold to wage war against a corrupt suit. It appealed to his deeply ingrained sense of rebellion. He looked left at Chibbs. Chibbs grinned, showing a gold tooth. He looked right at Grizzly. Grizzly cracked his massive knuckles. Rooster pushed the $10,000 back across the table. Keep your money, Mrs. Caldwell, Rooster said, standing up. He towered over her, casting a long shadow. We don't take money from grandmothers, but we do hate lawyers. Tears welled up in Beatrice's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. You'll do it? I ain't taking off my cut, Rooster warned, tapping the leather vest bearing the winged death's head. If I'm Richard Caldwell, then Richard Caldwell grew up to be the president of the Hells Angels. Beatrice managed a faint, trembling smile. Frankly, Mr. Rooster, knowing my son, that is the most believable part of this entire story. All right, boys, Rooster shouted, his voice booming across the diner. Mount up. We're taking a ride to the suburbs. We got a family reunion to attend. The diner erupted in cheers and the heavy scraping of chairs. Within minutes, the dirt lot outside was a symphony of roaring V-twin engines. Beatrice sat in the sidecar of Grizzly's modified trike, a spare helmet strapped to her head, clutching her handbag as 30 Hells Angels peeled out onto the highway, forming a protective, thunderous wedge around her. They were heading to Oak Creek, an affluent, gated community where the lawns were manicured with scissors and the cars cost more than most houses. They were about to bring the storm. The convoy of 30 Harleys, rolling into the pristine business district of Oak Creek, was an apocalyptic event for the locals. Baristas dropped coffee cups. Pedestrians froze on the sidewalks, clutching their pearls and cell phones as the ground vibrated beneath them. The thunderous roar of straight pipes echoing off the glass facades of high-end boutiques announced their arrival like a declaration of war. At the center of the formation, Grizzly's trike pulled up smoothly, and Rooster brought his massive custom chopper to a halt right on the curb in front of Sterling & Associates legal group. He kicked the stand down, the heavy iron settling onto the concrete. Chibbs, take 10 guys and lock down the perimeter. Nobody goes in, nobody comes out unless I say so, Rooster ordered, pulling off his sunglasses. You got it, boss, Chibbs replied, motioning for the crew to fan out. Huge, tattooed men in heavy leather vests casually took up posts by the front doors, the rear exit, and leaning against the expensive imported cars in the parking lot. Rooster walked over to the sidecar and offered his massive, calloused hand to Beatrice. She took it, stepping out with a surprising amount of grace. She adjusted her lavender cardigan, looked up at the towering glass building, and took a deep breath. You ready for this, Ma? Rooster asked, testing out the title. It felt strange on his tongue. Beatrice looked at him, her eyes hardening into diamonds. Let's go ruin this man's day, Richard. Rooster smirked. Accompanied by Grizzly and 2 other massive enforcers, Rooster and Beatrice pushed through the revolving glass doors of the lobby. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset, opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat as 5 enormous bikers swarmed her pristine white desk. "Jonathan Sterling," Rooster rumbled. "Where is he?" "Conference room B, 3rd floor," she stammered, her eyes darting to the death's head patches. "But he's in a very important meeting. You can't just—" Rooster was already walking toward the elevators. On the 3rd floor, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Inside Conference Room B, Jonathan Sterling was pacing. He was a man in his late 40s, wearing a tailored Italian suit that cost more than Rooster's bike. His hair was slicked back, and his face was twisted into an ugly scowl. Sitting around the mahogany table were 2 large private security guards, a terrified-looking notary public, and a medical doctor whose sweaty brow suggested he was deeply uncomfortable with the fraud he was committing. "Where is she?" Sterling barked into his phone. "I don't care if she went for a walk. Find the old bat." "The judge needs her signature on the evaluation forms by 3 p.m., or the conservatorship gets pushed to next month, and I am not paying the holding fees on the estate for another month." Sterling slammed the phone down. Incompetent fools. The woman can barely walk a mile, and they lost her. Just then, the heavy oak doors of Conference Room B did not just open, they violently exploded inward. The wood cracked against the drywall as Rooster's boot connected with the center panel. The 2 private security guards immediately jumped up, reaching into their jackets, but froze as Grizzly and the other 2 angels stepped into the room, their sheer size eclipsing the fluorescent lights. Sterling stumbled back, his face draining of color. "What is the meaning of this? Who the hell are you?" From behind the wall of leather, Beatrice Caldwell stepped forward, clutching her handbag. "Hello, Jonathan," she said pleasantly. Sterling's shock morphed into fury. "Beatrice, where have you been? And what is this? This circus?" "Guards, remove these thugs from my office immediately." The guards looked at Grizzly, who smiled, revealing a missing canine. The guards wisely kept their hands out of their jackets and didn't move an inch. "I don't think they're going anywhere, Johnny," Rooster said, strolling into the room. He didn't sit in a chair. He hopped up and sat directly on the polished mahogany conference table, crossing his heavy boots over a stack of legal documents. "Get off my table!" Sterling hissed, trying to regain control. "Beatrice, you are suffering from severe delusions. Bringing a biker gang into my office just proves you are a danger to yourself. Dr. Evans, note this in her file." "Dr. Evans," Rooster growled, locking eyes with the sweating doctor, "if you touch that pen, I'll make you eat it. Ink first." The doctor dropped his pen as if it were on fire. Sterling straightened his tie. "I am calling the police. You are trespassing." "Am I?" Rooster asked, feigning innocence. "I thought this was a meeting about my family's estate." Sterling paused, his hand hovering over the phone on the table. He looked at Rooster, really looked at him for the first time. He took in the faded tattoos, the gray in his beard, and the prominent, jagged scar on his chin. A flicker of something uncertainty? Fear? Crossed the lawyer's eyes. "Your family?" Sterling asked slowly. "Yeah," Rooster said, leaning forward. "My name is Richard Caldwell, and I hear you've been trying to declare me dead." The silence in the room was absolute. Sterling looked from Rooster to Beatrice, then back to Rooster. According to his files, Richard Caldwell had been missing for over 2 decades. The odds of him returning on the exact day the death declaration was meant to finalize were astronomically impossible. "You're lying," Sterling sneered, his voice dropping an octave. "Richard Caldwell is dead. He died a long time ago." "Do I look dead to you?" Rooster countered, pulling the faded 1,999 driver's license from his pocket and tossing it onto the table. It slid to a stop right in front of Sterling. Sterling picked it up. He studied the photo, then looked up at Rooster's face, his eyes lingering on the scar. The physical match was undeniable, but Jonathan Sterling was not a man who surrendered his golden goose easily. A slow, malicious smile spread across Sterling's face. He set the ID down and leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "A very impressive theater performance, Beatrice." Sterling clapped slowly. "Hiring a biker to play your dead son? It's desperate. It's pathetic. And it's fraud. "It is not fraud, Jonathan," Beatrice said, her voice shaking slightly, the first sign of weakness. "This is my son. The power of attorney is his." "No, it's not," Sterling said, reaching for a locked leather briefcase under the table. He clicked the combination lock open. "You see, Beatrice, I am a very thorough man. When millions of dollars are on the line, I don't leave things to chance. I didn't just file the paperwork to declare Richard dead. I hired one of the most expensive private investigative firms in the state to hunt down his last known whereabouts." Sterling pulled out a thick, red manila folder and slammed it onto the table. Rooster felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. Grizzly shifted his weight, sensing the sudden shift in the room's power dynamic. "You see," Sterling continued, his eyes gleaming with triumph, "I know you're not Richard Caldwell, Mr. Biker, because 3 weeks ago, my investigators actually found the real Richard Caldwell." Sterling opened the folder, pulling out a glossy 8x10 photograph, and held it up for the room to see. "And unless you underwent some extreme reconstructive surgery and shrunk 6 inches, Sterling smirked, looking dead at Rooster, "you are sitting in the wrong chair." The glossy 8x10 photograph hit the mahogany table with a soft, sickening slap. Everyone in conference room B leaned in, their eyes darting to the image. It showed a man in a beige hospital gown, looking heavily sedated, sitting in a wheelchair on a sunlit patio. He had thinning hair, a vacant stare, and no scar on his chin. "This," Jonathan Sterling said, his voice dripping with venomous triumph, "is the real Richard Caldwell. He is currently residing in a private long-term care facility just outside of Reno, Nevada. He was diagnosed with early-onset dementia 3 years ago. As the executor of the Caldwell estate, I was naturally designated as his legal guardian when he was located. He signed full proxy rights over to me last week." Sterling turned his predatory gaze toward Beatrice, who stood frozen, the color completely draining from her wrinkled cheeks. "Did you really think I was just sitting on my hands for the last 3 months, Beatrice?" Sterling sneered, rounding the table. "I knew Richard was the only threat to my conservatorship over you, so I found him. And frankly, your stunt today just seals your fate. You brought an armed biker gang into a law office to commit identity fraud. Judge Harrison will have you in a locked psychiatric ward by midnight." Beatrice swayed slightly on her feet. The fight seemed to leave her fragile bones all at once. Grizzly instinctively reached out a massive hand to steady her shoulder. "So," Sterling said, looking back at Rooster, "I suggest you take your little leather-clad friends and ride back to whatever dive bar you crawled out of before I have you arrested for extortion." Silence descended on the room. The terrified notary held her breath. Dr. Evans, the corrupt physician, wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, looking relieved that the bikers had been outmaneuvered. But Rooster didn't move. He didn't get off the table. He didn't look angry, and he certainly didn't look defeated. Instead, a low, rumbling chuckle started deep in Rooster's chest. It grew louder, echoing off the glass walls of the conference room. He threw his head back and laughed, a genuine, booming laugh that sent a fresh wave of unease rippling through the private security guards. "What is so funny?" Sterling demanded, his smug facade cracking slightly. Rooster stopped laughing. His eyes locked onto Sterling, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy leather cut. The security guards tensed, but Rooster didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a heavy, heavily scratched, rusted silver Zippo lighter. He tossed it through the air. It landed with a loud, metallic clack directly on top of the photograph of the man in the wheelchair. "You're a thorough man, Johnny," Rooster said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "You hire expensive investigators. You forge medical records. You probably even found some poor, nameless drifter in a state hospital and paid off the administrators to slap the name Richard Caldwell on his chart, just to cover your bases. But your investigators missed one tiny, crucial detail. Which is," Sterling snapped. Rooster pointed at the rusted lighter. "Turn it over." Sterling hesitated, then snatched the lighter off the photograph. He flipped it over. Engraved into the tarnished metal, barely visible beneath years of scuffs and burns, was a winged death's head, the unmistakable insignia of the Hells Angels. Beneath it were 2 words, Oakland Charter. "Richard Caldwell didn't just ride with a bad crowd," Rooster said, his eyes shifting to Beatrice. whose eyes were wide with shock. When he left home in the 90s, he went straight to Oakland, the birthplace of the heavy hitters. He prospected under guys who rode with Ralph Sonny Barger himself. By 1998, Richard wasn't just a runaway kid. He was a fully patched member of the Hells Angels. His road name was Crasher. Sterling swallowed hard, dropping the lighter back onto the table as if it burned his fingers. Fairy tales. You're making this up. I wish I was, Rooster said softly, the hostility bleeding out of his voice, replaced by a heavy, mournful weight. He looked directly at Beatrice now. Ma'am, Beatrice, I didn't want to tell you this. I came here today to play a part, to scare this suit and get you your freedom. But you deserve the truth. Beatrice gripped her handbag tighter. What truth? Richard was a wild one, just like you said, Rooster continued, the room completely captivated by the raw honesty in the giant man's voice. I met him in Reno in 2003. We were running a joint operation between charters. Crasher and we got close. We were brothers. He kept this Polaroid in his wallet, the one you showed me today. He told me he left a good mother behind because he was too angry and too proud to admit he was wrong. Tears began to spill over Beatrice's eyelashes, silently tracking down her powdered cheeks. October 14th, 2003, Rooster said, pointing to his own scarred chin. We were riding through the Sierra Nevadas, black ice on a blind curve. A semi-truck swerved into our lane. Crasher laid his bike down to avoid a head-on collision. I went down right behind him. My chin got ripped open on the guardrail. Rooster paused, his jaw tightening as the ghosts of that night flooded back into his mind. His gas tank ruptured. By the time I crawled over to him, it was too late. I pulled him out of the fire, but he was gone. I took his wallet and his lighter. The club buried him out in the desert, looking at the mountains. He died 20 years ago. Beatrice. A strangled sob escaped Beatrice's throat. Grizzly, the towering mountain of a man, gently placed both his hands on her frail shoulders, offering a silent, immovable pillar of support. Rooster turned his terrifying gaze back to Jonathan Sterling. So, Rooster growled, sliding off the table and taking a slow, heavy step toward the lawyer. I know for a fact the man in that photograph is a fraud. I know you manufactured a fake heir to steal this woman's money. And what's worse, Johnny, you used my dead brother's name to do it. Sterling backed up until his spine hit the whiteboard. Panic flared in his eyes. He looked at Dr. Evans. This is absurd, Sterling shouted, his voice cracking. He has no proof. Dr. Evans, call the police right now. Tell them this man is threatening us. Dr. Evans stood up, his medical bag trembling in his grip. He looked at Sterling, then looked at the 4 massive Hells Angels blocking the only exit, their faces carved from stone. I think I left my stethoscope in the car, Dr. Evans squeaked. He dropped the falsified medical evaluation forms onto the table. I'm sorry, Jonathan. I'm not going to federal prison for you. The Alzheimer's diagnosis is fake. He paid me $50,000 to sign it. Shut up, you idiot! Sterling screamed, lunging across the table to grab the papers. Restrain him! Sterling yelled to his 2 private security guards. They're trespassing! Get them out! The guards exchanged a frantic look. They were paid $50 an hour to stand around looking tough, not to fight the president of a Hells Angels charter and his enforcers. The braver of the 2 guards stepped forward, raising his hands. All right, guys, let's just step outside and... Grizzly moved with a terrifying speed that defied his massive frame. He grabbed the guard by the lapels of his tailored suit, lifted him a full 6 inches off the floor, and slammed him against the glass wall. The impact rattled the entire 3rd floor. Grizzly didn't hit him. He just held him there, his forearm pressing against the man's throat. Take a nap, mate, Chibbs whispered to the 2nd guard, pulling a massive Bowie knife from his boot and casually cleaning his fingernails with it. The 2nd guard immediately raised his hands, walked over to a corner chair, and sat down quietly. The power dynamic in Conference Room B had completely collapsed. Jonathan Sterling, the slick, untouchable corporate lawyer, was now backed into a corner, his Italian suit rumpled, his breathing shallow and erratic. The meticulously constructed web of lies he had spent months weaving to trap an 8-6-year old widow had just been violently dismantled by a ghost from the highway. Rooster stepped up to the mahogany table. He picked up the falsified Alzheimer's diagnosis and slowly, deliberately, ripped it in half. Then, he ripped it again. He let the pieces flutter to the floor like snow. Next, he picked up a blank legal pad and a Mont Blanc fountain pen from Sterling's folio. He slid them across the polished wood until they rested right in front of the trembling lawyer. "Here is what is going to happen, Johnny," Rooster said, his voice eerily calm, contrasting the primal violence simmering just beneath the surface. "You are going to draft a document right now. In it, you will completely and permanently relinquish your status as the executor of the Arthur Caldwell estate. You will waive all rights, claims, and conservatorship powers over Beatrice Caldwell." I can't do that under duress," Sterling stammered, looking at the terrified notary who was trying to make herself invisible in her chair. "It won't hold up in court." "Oh, it'll hold up," Rooster assured him, leaning in close enough for Sterling to smell the stale tobacco and worn leather on him. "Because if you ever try to contest it, I will personally ride back down here. And next time, I won't use the front door. We'll start visiting your house in the suburbs. We'll introduce ourselves to your country club. You understand what happens to people who steal from the angels, Johnny?" Sterling swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing rapidly. He looked at the rusted Zippo lighter, still resting on the table. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. He had crossed a line that the law couldn't protect him from. With shaking hands, Sterling picked up the heavy gold pen. For the next 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the scratch of the nib against the thick legal paper, and the heavy, ragged breathing of the security guard Grizzly was still pinning to the glass. Sterling finished writing. He signed his name at the bottom, the signature wildly erratic compared to his usual practiced cursive. Rooster slid the pad over to the notary public. "Ma'am, if you would be so kind." The notary practically lunged forward, grabbing her official stamp from her briefcase. She stamped the document, signed her own name, and shoved it back across the table as if it were radioactive. Rooster picked up the document, folded it neatly, and walked over to Beatrice. Beatrice had stopped crying, though her eyes were still red-rimmed. She stood tall, leaning slightly on her leather handbag. Rooster gently placed the folded paper into her trembling hand. "He can't touch you anymore, Beatrice," Rooster said softly. "The estate is yours. You hire a new lawyer tomorrow, a clean one, and you fire this piece of trash." Beatrice looked down at the paper, then up at the giant scarred biker who had just saved her life. She reached out with her free hand and gently touched his cheek, her thumb grazing the edge of the jagged scar that he shared with her late son. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You gave me back my home, and you gave me back my Richard." Knowing he found a brotherhood, knowing he wasn't alone when he passed. It brings an old woman a peace you will never comprehend, Mr. Rooster. Rooster swallowed hard, an unfamiliar tightness gripping his throat. "He was a good man, Ma. He fought like hell. And he talked about you all the time." Rooster cleared his throat, pushing the emotion back down where it belonged. He turned to face the room. "Chibbs, let him down," Rooster ordered. Chibbs nodded to Grizzly, who casually dropped the gasping security guard to the carpet. Rooster looked at Dr. Evans. "You, call the police. Tell them you want to confess to medical fraud and conspiracy. If you try to run, my boys in the Nevada charter will find you before the sun sets." Dr. Evans nodded frantically, already pulling his cell phone from his pocket. Rooster looked at Sterling one last time. The lawyer was a broken shell, slumped against the wall, staring blankly at his ruined career. "Let's ride, boys," Rooster barked. The angels turned and marched out of the conference room, leaving the heavy oak doors shattered on their hinges. They escorted Beatrice down the elevator, across the pristine white lobby, and back out into the blinding Mojave sun. The 30 Harleys were still idling in the lot, the deep, guttural rumble of their engines drowning out the sounds of the affluent suburb. Rooster helped Beatrice back into the sidecar of Grizzly's trike. "Where to, Ma?" Grizzly asked, flashing a surprisingly gentle, toothy grin. "Take me home, David," Beatrice said, using his real name. "I have an orchard to tend to." Rooster swung his heavy leg over his chopper and kicked it into gear. As the convoy roared out of the parking lot, leaving the shattered world of Jonathan Sterling behind, Rooster reached into his cut and pulled out the rusted Zippo. He gripped it tightly in his leather-gloved hand, feeling the engraved wings pressed into his palm. Richard was gone, but the code remained. They had protected the innocent. They had punished the wicked. As they hit the open highway, the wind howling past them, Rooster looked over at the frail, lavender-clad woman riding in the sidecar. She was smiling, her face turned toward the sun. For today, the Hells Angels hadn't just been an outlaw motorcycle club. For today, they had been family. The incredible real-life dynamic between a desperate 86-year-old widow and the most notorious motorcycle club in the world proves that heroes don't always wear capes sometimes. They wear heavy leather and ride Harleys. Beatrice Caldwell's absolute refusal to be victimized by a corrupt legal system and Rooster's adherence to an unbreakable outlaw code of honor collided to create an unforgettable story of justice, redemption, and unexpected brotherhood. The twist of Richard's true fate adds a heartbreaking but beautiful layer of closure to a mother who never gave up hope. If this gritty, heartwarming story of outlaw justice kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible, true-to-life dramas that prove reality is stranger and more beautiful than fiction. Keep riding safe out there!
Hi, my name is Dominant Flame Escrow, the owner and manager of King's Obsession Concord. After watching the video, can you pretend to be my son today? 86-year-old woman asked Hells Angels. What? I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the loneliness and kindness at the heart of the story. Sometimes a simple request can reveal how much human connection matters, especially for someone who may be feeling forgotten or alone. What made the story meaningful to me was seeing people look beyond appearances and respond with compassion when it was needed most. Do you think small acts of kindness can have a bigger impact than we realize? And have you ever had a moment when a stranger's kindness completely changed your day? Stories like this remind me that we don't always need grand gestures to make a difference. Sometimes just showing up for someone can mean more than words ever could. If this story touched you in some way, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy heartfelt biker stories about compassion, connection, and unexpected friendships, feel free to like and subscribe for more whenever you'd like.